what white people did, what white Christians did, was come to a continent that was already thriving, and it had economy, and it had government, and it had societies, and it had spirituality, and it had structure. And we were like, nah.
Hi, my name's leowt, and you have found your way to the Conversations podcast. Conversations exist to create spiritually minded conversations about life. We desire to create safe space for dialogue and community. We desire to come together regularly and intentionally to generate conversations about life, belief, and the intersection of the two. Everyone is welcome at the conversation.
Right. Friends, hey, hi, how are you? I'm not sure if we're live yet. Let's see. Oh, there we are. Friends. It's so exciting to be here with you this week, friends. This is the much anticipated conversation with my friend, who actually is completely anonymous to me until this very moment. But my friend here runs an account called the Decolonized Christian on Instagram. And it's been a massive part of my understanding and my, let's say, emergence from the sort of binary of colonized and uncolonized. I've learned so much recently, and I have to give, I have to be honest and give credit to the fact that I live near the Seneca Nation territory. And so I have been blessed to learn a lot of things through the people and the places of the Seneca Nation. So short of doing a full land acknowledgement, because I am not equipped to do so, I would like to make that acknowledgement that I am coming to you from what I do believe is Seneca Nation territory land. And I'm coming to you today on the first day of Native American Heritage Month. Now, this is something that my friend and I have been planning for a while, but actually, I didn't know that we were going to be going live today on the first day of Native American Heritage Month. But I think it's rather fitting, because what we're going to talk about today is the idea of decolonization. For those of you who have watched before, we've done a podcast on colonization, sort of a colonizer 101. What is it? How do we deal with it? Why is it bad? You know, what are the repercussions? But today we're going to get really specific and talk a little bit more in depth about decolonization, especially when it comes to the ways in which religions have played a role in that. So I'm very excited about this, but I'm going to let my friend introduce themselves to whatever level they feel comfortable, and then we'll get started.
Mm-hmm. Well, hi, thank you so much, Leo, for having me on the podcast. Yeah, I too am not fully equipped to do so, but I come to you on the unceded territories of the Stolo people, specifically. This is unceded territory in what is now known as Abbotsford, British Columbia, Canada. And it's on the traditional lands of the Matsqui in the Stolo Nation here. So thank you. And we have a lot of work to do moving forward. There's land acknowledgements are not enough. Land acknowledgements are merely virtue signaling if nothing's done. And so I want to make that known right off the top. And there's just a long way to go in that process. So.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for your introduction, and thank you for that little sort of educational piece of, just like where you are from and whose land you're on. I do know, folks who are watching, that there is actually a text service where you can text them where you're located, and they'll actually tell you whose lands you are on. I will drop that in the comment box a little bit later, because I'm going to give my full attention to our conversation here. But that's something that we talked back in our interview with Mark Charles. If you're interested in watching that, we talked about how the phrase "we the people" is the most misguided concept in the entirety of American history. Mark Charles is a Navajo activist, and I would very highly encourage you to check out that episode as well. So I would actually like to hear a little bit about how you got started in this work. For those of you who don't know, the Decolonized Christian is an insanely informational Instagram account. I came across it when I wanted to intentionally start to decolonize my faith, because while I might loathe Christianity at a lot of points. I've realized that it's where I come from. And so I bear some culpability in making it better. And one of the things I wanted to do with my faith system was decolonize that. And I actually came across the Decolonized Christian because I literally put in the search bar, decolonize and Christian. But this
amazing.
Instagram account has been a really big help. So I'd love to hear, like, kind of how did you get started on this path?
Well, yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Mark Charles, because he was a huge, huge reason I started this page. I finished his book, Unsettling Truths. If you haven't read that book, that is the book to read for any people who want just kind of a decolonizing Christianity 101, how imperialism became joined with Christianity. That book radically changed my view. And I must also make the point that decolonized and Christian is an oxymoron in very many ways in the West. We will never be able to fully decolonize Christianity because of the harm it has done, because of the legacy of the doctrine of discovery, and because of how it continues to, basically, this term hegemonic. It dominates over all other systems, all other beliefs, in this land that we now call America and Canada, and in the West in general. So, so many indigenous languages and traditions and things have been lost in the process and will sadly never be recovered because of the legacy of Christianity and what that did here.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's an incredibly salient point too. And I have to acknowledge that I also am a white person coming to a conversation from a Christian perspective about decolonization. And I can't think, from my understanding of Native history, I cannot think of two things that have been more actively evil, I guess, in the history of Native and Indigenous populations than Christianity and Europeans. And that's where I'm coming to this conversation from. But I'm hoping that we can have it. You know what I mean? So,
yes.
So you read Mark Charles' book, right? And then what happened next?
Yeah. So then as I was learning and wrestling through that and wrestling through my own journey and my own process, I decided to start a page to document my own journey of decolonizing as a Christian, as someone who actually works in a church, like as someone who trained their whole life to be a minister and work towards that. I wanted to then be as transparent as possible and bring people on that journey of not just showing them where Christianity has been harmful in the West, but also helping. I believe change happens in community, and I think together we can creatively imagine a better world that we want to create, something that is less harmful, at the very least, less harmful than what there is now. And I don't use the term. I don't throw around the term reconciliation often because I think it can be a harmful term, but Mark Charles also suggests the word is conciliation. I think coming to grips with the fact that things have never been good between white settlers and indigenous people because of the harm that's been caused, the genocide, the land theft, you name it. Yeah. And so even talking about those terms is privileged because we really don't get to have a say in whether or not that happens. Right. That belongs entirely with indigenous people. So
absolutely. I loved that part that Mark brought up about we can't have reconciliation because we never had conciliation in the first place. And I think that's, I guess, sort of what first started to open my eyes, right, to sort of my own history. It came first in a secular realm, learning just, sort of history, period. And then I started to realize the intrinsic nature of Christianity and colonization and how those things coincide and really prop each other up, to be honest.
Yeah.
Did you grow up in a church setting?
I did grow up in a church setting. Yeah, I grew up. So bit of my story. I grew up in a very conservative homeschooled, family homeschooled grade K to 7.
Okay.
And from there, eventually went off to Christian school, and that's where I graduated high school. But my family is very evangelical, I guess that's the word for it. Very conservative and Christian and privileged. That's my background. And I've had to come to grips with that and the reality of that, and learning some of the harmful mentalities of understanding the world, believing that Christians were the most oppressed people, and that we needed to, as a result, defend our own rights and defend all those things. And then hitting a point, realizing that, wait a minute, that's not true.
Yeah.
And
right.
coming to grips with that. So that's been a whole journey of the last decade or so in my life, kind of coming to terms with that. And in so doing, then also understanding the ways Christianity has been colonized, or has been used to colonize, pardon me.
Absolutely. It's so interesting to me that, I grew up in a conservative Christian evangelical home, and the practicalities that I were taught are what made me who I am today. But when I express those practicalities now, the evangelical church is like, heretic. You know what I mean? Like I get heretic, I get false prophet, I get called son of Satan, I get called all these apostate. I really have graduated from heretic to apostate. And I get called all these things on a regular basis for simply asserting the things that I was taught back there about loving everybody. I just apparently carry that out too far. I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting how loving can suddenly become a heresy. It's like, I wonder what, and I think that ties into colonizing theology, right? Theology that it's about power, it's about control, it's about dominating the narrative, it's about, it's really about determining what people do and what they don't do. And I mean, that's where you use fear. That's where you use those as a tool to basically manipulate people into doing what you want them to do. And I argue that that is how Christianity is colonizing for everyone. It causes harm for everyone, even the people that it supposedly is supposed to benefit. Yeah. And I think that is where you hear these words like deconstruction being thrown around a lot right now. I think that's why, rightfully so, there's so much of that happening. It's people are realizing that this is actually harmful and this doesn't benefit them at all. And this is actually bad news.
Yeah. Right? No, it's not bad. It's not good news. I mean, it's not good news for everybody, right? I mean, it might be good news, but it's not for like anybody who doesn't look like me.
Exactly.
It's just wild. Now, I don't want to lose everybody who's watching, because we have a good amount of people watching right now. But there have been, we're going to put a pause on that. Someone just brought up the Christian boarding schools and the history that I know both America and Canada have with these. In particular, in Canada, I believe that the body count has continued to rise for people that were, for the bodies of people that were found at these Native schools. What has been sort of the cultural conversation that you've been having since all of this started to come up with the bodies being found at these schools?
Oh boy, yeah, this has brought a lot of stuff to the surface. But I think for Canadians especially, we've lived in a lot of ignorance over the years, and this is also partly due to our own privilege and white supremacy, because Indigenous peoples had been saying for forever that this has been happening ever since these schools have started. They're like, our children didn't come home. Right. Where are they? Right? They've never come home. And there was never any investigations. There was never any kind of follow through on some of those. And or if there were any, it was just very minor and sort of, that was it. And so Indigenous people have known that there is a large number of missing people, missing children. But I think the greater Canadian body didn't realize to what extent that was.
Mhm.
And so just kind of for a little bit of a history, back in May, 215 graves were found in Kamloops, the Kamloops former residential school site, boarding school, run by the Catholic Church.
Mhm.
215 unmarked graves. And it shook Canada to the core for sure. But since then, I think from what I understand now, though I haven't checked specifically, but last I checked, the count was over 7,000 unmarked graves have been found in Canada. And we haven't even started looking in America yet. And
Yeah.
there was more schools in America than there were in Canada. And those numbers are going to be even higher there,
Yeah.
unfortunately, when that starts being a thing.
Yeah,
So.
I can't even fathom that, because I've been watching, following your page, and then a bunch of other accounts that I intentionally follow. Side note, you cannot be passively intersectional. This is for those of you who are watching. You can't be passively intersectional. And so if you ever want to be able to think and act outside of your own perspective, you must intentionally consume information from a perspective that is not your own. And so I've been following these accounts online and watching the amount of graves rise, and knowing that America is not even close to the reckoning. I'm not saying Canada has done everything right, but like, I'm just saying y'all didn't have Trump. That's all I'm saying, because these are conversations that need to be happening. Like you said, I mean, those borders for Indigenous folks were not the borders we have drawn now. And so there is remnants of this same stain on our country as it was in yours. I mean, our country's language says that referred to people as merciless savages. It wasn't until I learned this week, that it wasn't until 1924 that Native Americans were considered full citizens and granted that protection via a constitutional amendment. 1924, like that's not even 100 years ago for us.
Well, in Canada, I would argue that that's not even the case today.
Mhm.
The Indian Act, which is that's the legislation that allows for our reserve system that we have in Canada, it's still got its basic framework as when it first was legislated in the late 1800s.
Mhm.
And it still contains dehumanizing language towards Indigenous people in it. And so as long as that legislation exists, systemic racism towards Indigenous peoples will continue to exist in Canada.
Yeah.
And that's just something that we have to come to grips with, and why there needs to be systemic change in this country. Because, and I mean, of course, in America too, but yeah, I can only really speak for Canada because I'm mostly aware of Canada's system. But you know, these schools that were run, this was all part of the Indian Act, right? It was forced removal of children by the state, and then put into these schools that were run by the church. And so, and it was a multi-denominational thing. Predominantly it was Catholic, for sure. I think it was over 60% was Catholic from what I understand. You may need to fact check that. But it was the Catholic Church, and then Anglican, which is kind of similar to Episcopal. I guess it would be Episcopalian.
Yep.
And then the United Church. And then there were some other denominations that even filled in for residential schools. For instance, the Mennonites in Canada filled in so that they wouldn't have to go to war during World War II. And so that is a big, huge thing in Canada, that as a result of that, the Mennonite Church has actually been kind of really on top of decolonizing because of their own harm towards this. And so they've been doing a really good job in a lot of ways. I mean, I think they can always do better, but they've at least been one of the more outspoken denominations in Canada about the harm that colonizing Christianity has caused towards Indigenous people. So, but yeah, it's ironic because, you know, you are a pacifist denomination. You believe, you know, that you aren't allowed to kill, so you don't go to war, but then you go and participate in another system of violence towards people in your own country.
I'm
So
actually like shook right now because of that, because we actually had a friend of mine who is a lifelong Mennonite came on the podcast a couple months ago, and we talked about that sort of fundamental and deep-rooted and holistic commitment to pacifism. I think if anything, it just shows to me that there is something within Christianity, and maybe it exists within other religions too, but I'm just speaking from my own space right now. There is something within Christianity that has developed. I don't know if it was there originally, but it has developed to support and bolster colonization. I mean, even the Gospels originally are actually like wildly anti-Semitic in a lot of ways. You know what I mean? So there's something foundationally in there that is bringing us here. And that brings me to my next question, which I've been dying to talk to you about. Everybody else, you can just stop watching right now. No, I'm just kidding. Please don't. But I've been dying to have this conversation, and I'm going to set it up for our friends a little bit, okay? People who are watching, the idea in Christianity, which most of you will be familiar with, is that Jesus died on the cross to forgive you of your sins so you can go to heaven when you die. That's kind of the basic evangelical equation that's out there, right? That idea is called atonement theology. Basically, Christ dying on the cross atoned for our sins. Now we can go to heaven. But my friend and I here have been having an interesting conversation about how atonement theology is actually largely, in part, related to colonization. And I am dying to hear your take on this.
Oh boy. Okay. Atonement. Yeah, I think atonement theology is possibly, if not the biggest theology that I think provides a solid foundation for colonial Christianity, for imperial Christianity in the West specifically. So I guess I should define atonement first. So atonement theology that we're talking about is penal substitutionary atonement. Atonement as in referring to Jesus's death and the purpose of his death and even his resurrection, what that means for the church. Atonement is a doctrine that's been debated basically since the very beginning of Christianity. And that just describes that process of Jesus's death and resurrection. And there's many theories out there. Penal substitutionary atonement, which has become like the gospel to most Western Christians, certainly evangelicals. It's baked into the fabric of evangelicalism specifically because of its tie to the fundamentalist movement and all that. That theology is penal substitutionary atonement, which is actually one of the more recent atonement theologies that exists. And so there's lots of different theories out there, but penal substitutionary atonement, this idea that God needed a sacrifice for our sins specifically, that Jesus took our place on the cross in our stead. That view of atonement is the one I'm talking about. And that view of atonement is not an orthodox view of atonement at all. And I would argue that the early Christians would have seen that as a heresy against God, because to the earliest Christians, Jesus was God. And so if you are claiming that God needed a sacrifice, well, you're missing the point of the self-sacrifice, right? Like you're separating God and Jesus, which is like a big no-no in there for the Orthodox Christians. So, yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why I talk so much about penal substitutionary atonement and how harmful it is, because we use that view, right, to basically say, oh, it should have been you on the cross, and then we feel all terrible about ourselves, and all our songs are about that. Oh God, you are so great, and I am so bad.
Couldn't survive without the classic, that notion.
Exactly, right? So we feel real bad about ourselves, but in that process, then we feel really good about ourselves because Jesus, oh, you're so great, you saved us, blah blah blah. Yeah, it's a dangerous theology. Why
do you think that links so strongly to colonization?
Because I think with that theology, you can basically determine who's in and who's out, right? You can basically say, you can use fear, you can use the pain of Jesus to basically incite grief in people, to stir up emotion in people, and then basically manipulate them with threats of hellfire. That's, I think, the big danger. And the other thing about it that's so harmful and so colonizing is it's based in retribution and appeasement, which is the opposite of the reconciliation of God, or if we're going to even use that term, it's the opposite of redemptive love or of restorative justice, right? So it's retributive. It's a way of basically God needs punishment to be appeased, right? Rather than maybe it was humanity that demanded the sacrifice, not God, right? And so that's one of the things I like to talk about is the different atonement theories. So there's a whole bunch of different ones out there, and I think there's some that are more violent than others for sure. And so I really try to focus on the non-violent atonement theories. And I'd like to put out a shout to Inverse Podcast here. They recently did a whole series on non-violent atonement theories. I posted, if you go to my Instagram handle at the Decolonized Christian, I've put on my story highlights. One of my highlights is atonement, and I've posted links to all those episodes because they are just so good. I recommend people listen to all of them. They are fantastic.
I love it. I'll drop those in the show notes and stuff there. So
but it's a heavy conversation, but basically I think what we need to do is to decolonize at least our. So if it's a violent atonement theory that makes God basically into some sort of monster that needs to be appeased, then it causes harm and it needs to go.
Yeah.
And so, there's lots of different theories out there, but I think one of the things that there was one of the podcasts that they talked about just this idea even of sacrifice, and you had brought up anti-Semitism at one point too regarding the Gospels. And one of the things that he pointed out in this episode is that to understand sacrifice, we've basically colonized the term sacrifice because sacrifice itself is not like a heavy sort of like, it wasn't supposed to be some sort of like burdensome process or like some sort of like negative thing, but it was actually a celebration in the Jewish culture, right? Sacrifice was like a feast. It was a national holiday. It was, all those things. And so I think start reframing the idea of sacrifice towards that is already a first start, like a first, just a really helpful way to reframe that idea. Right. So if Jesus's death was a sacrifice, we are celebrating the fact that Jesus said no more to death, no more to, he's bringing new life, that kind of idea. And so I think for sacrifice, though, it was humanity who needed the sacrifice, not God. Yeah. And so that's where, some of these theories, some of these other views are really helpful.
Yeah, I'm going to be looking into that because I actually want to do an episode entirely based around atonement theology. But I think that for the purposes of this conversation, it's pretty easy to see how if you have an angry child killing God, right, you can get to the place where you need to take children from their environment. And literally the phrase in America, which might have been the same there, the phrase that was used a lot with these residential schools was kill the Indian and save the man. And so you have this idea of an angry God who's angry because, people don't believe in them. So of course you have to sacrifice your way of life and your comfort and your culture to become one with this God. But the thing is that Native spirituality existed long before white people ever stepped on our shores, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think part of the issue is that Christianity has become so disembodied. We've separated soul from flesh, essentially, right? It's not just Descartes who said, I think, therefore I am, and brought reason to made it the pinnacle, right? I mean, it's Platonic. It goes back to Plato, right? Plato is kind of the father of a lot of our modern philosophy, and he really created dualism in that kind of sense, right? And so I think Christianity is sort of especially imperial Christianity has thrived off of that dualism and has used that as a tool. You know, there's those who are in and there's those who are out there. You're either Christian or you're not. You're either good or you're bad. There's good and evil. There's, you know, I mean, you could go on. I think Christianity's really thrived off of that dualism. And I think part of the work of decolonizing is to learn how to have a more embodied Christianity where it's both, and it's not a separation of them. I think what we've done is a lot of Christians may say that, oh, it is both, but they use the spiritual, or the not even spiritual, the soul first. They prioritize that part first over the actual physical part, the physical aspects of our lives, and the body and the flesh, right? And so I think we've done that with our atonement too. We've mystified it. We've made it this mystical thing. And in the process of doing that, we neglect the fact that Jesus was killed by powerful religious elites in bed with the empire. And he was a victim of the state.
Yeah.
Right. And so while we spiritualize what that act did, we also must not ignore the fact that this was an act of what powerful people do when they're threatened, right?
Absolutely. And it wasn't even, been so interesting to me as I've been learning the history more of the Gospels, particularly because I'm in an interpreting the Gospels class. It's really interesting to me that if people want to say, well, like Jesus killed, or the Jews killed Jesus, but a more accurate statement would be the Romans, the Italians killed Jesus, because like that's who did it. And the issue wasn't necessarily a counter religious faction. It was the actual empire. And if you look at that narrative today, it's the empire that is destroying people who believe different religiously. And I think part of what threatens, why Christians feel so threatened about, especially Native spirituality, is that it's not a creedal religion. It is not a patriarchal religion, and it's highly in tune with the here and now. And I think a lot of Christianity has lost sight of the here and now. And so it's really easy to see how if you just look at this structure of like one God dying for sins, and then you have this earth-based, natural-based, expansive, beautiful, intuitive, matriarchal spirituality that can't be contained in a creed. Well, all of a sudden you create a space for, literally either killing the people or trying to kill their spirituality right out of them, which is which is exactly.
And it makes me think too, because it brings me to this thought I had recently, but the reality is Judaism was an indigenous religion as well. They're in like the Old Testament, like the Jewish Bible, is an indigenous text. And I think what Christianity has done in a lot of ways has colonized Judaism, because we no longer see through a Jewish lens, and we forget that Jesus was fully Jewish too. Like, he wasn't Christian. He was fully Jewish, and everything he taught, everything he did, the way he told stories, the way he interpreted the law was very Jewish. You can patterns and even some similar stories that were told by other rabbis for hundreds of years, like even before him. And he lived into that tradition fully. He fully embodied what it meant to be Jewish, and yet spoke truth to power, to the systems of power that were oppressive. And that was a threat, right? But one of the things that comes to mind too, like I think of, and I have to credit individuals like Will Gaffney, who wrote Womanist Midrash.
She's coming on the podcast to talk about Womanist Midrash.
Oh, fantastic.
I'm so excited.
That's amazing. She is phenomenal. And one of the things she pointed out was the word for spirit in the creation story is actually in the Hebrew language grammatically feminine. And that is a powerful reality as well, right? Judaism is not a dualistic religion, right? It's the way that you understand Judaism is more like, it's more like they're, even when they talk about day and night in the creation account, it's not dualism, it's including everything in between. It's talking about dawn and dusk, male and female. It's discussing everything in between. You know, there's space for all of that within Judaism, which is powerful. And Jesus even has hints of that in the way he talks about individuals who are non-binary, using the term that was common in that day was eunuch, right? And so he discusses, he distinguishes between 3 different types of eunuchs in that day, and that's a powerful statement that he makes right there. It's baked into the text as well. And again, Jesus is fully Jewish, and he embodied that fully. I think Christianity it was very much based off of Platonic dualism, like we talked about, and it created a dualistic a dualistic religion. Yes. Based on the things Jesus said and did, right? But it started serving the needs of empire rather than turning the world upside down, so to speak, rather than a liberative path that spoke truth to power and that prioritized those who are marginalized and oppressed.
Exactly. And you can see, I'm just actually going to stop my camera now and let you talk for the rest of our time together, because we are apparently reading the same authors and really channeling similar thoughts. But it's so interesting because if you look at Judaism is still deeply meaningful, current modern religion. And they've survived attempts at colonization. But Christianity, in so many ways, began with the colonization of Judaism and arguably some other paganistic type of religions from the period, and then just kept continually colonizing. And Christianity colonized. Therefore, it is an apt and well-equipped tool for the colonizer. And I think you can look throughout history, and I'm not saying every other religion is perfect and Christianity is shit, but what I am saying is that you can see throughout history the ways in which this particular doctrine, which was not orthodox, as you so aptly pointed out, has been used to control and manipulate and incite fear. What white people did, what white Christians did, was come to a continent that was already thriving, and it had economy, and it had government, and it had societies, and it had spirituality, and it had structure. And we were like, nah. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know if it's Mark Charles that says it, but you can't discover lands that are already occupied. So this American or European colonizer notion was fully bolstered by a text that's in a lot of ways based on and constructed around the ability to be able to colonize, which is the antithesis of the text originally.
It is. It's 100%. And actually, Willie Jennings, who's another theologian author I'm deeply, deeply influenced by, he is writing a book right now on this topic. Hopefully it's going to be coming out soon, because I can't wait to get my hands on it. But he's looking at creation, and then he's tying in missions and tying in how missionaries originally, what does it mean to the Great Commission, right? What is that all about? And I know Willie Jennings, a lot of his work is around decolonizing Christianity as well. And the Gospel of Mark's Great Commission says to go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation, not just people, but we're talking about the whole cosmos, essentially. Like, this has to be good news for all creation. And I think there's something so important there. That's a piece we sometimes ignore. And anyway, Jennings is talking about 2 different types of missionaries that first arose out of the early church. And one was essentially a type of missionary that went and saw how Christ was already at work within people, like a people group or in a specific place and region, because the whole message of Christ is moving everywhere, not just within certain people, right? And so, sorry, I'm gonna cough. Pardon me. And he's talking about how basically they would go and become immersed in a culture, become connected to a people, and then in time would share about the way Christ is already at work within that people. And that's essentially what it means to speak in a mother tongue, you know, that whole picture of Acts, where people are speaking in tongues. Like, I'm from a Pentecostal tradition, so I love like that whole speaking in tongues thing is sort of part of my background. But it's interesting, he defines mother tongue as the language that a mother would speak to her newborn, like the intimate connection between a mother and her newborn or her children. And coming to a people and speaking to them in that language, that means you're actually probably learning their language, not the other way around, right? Like you're becoming one with them in community.
Yes.
You know, you're that kind of picture, right? And so that is the picture of one type of missionary that came out of the early Christian movement, you know, the early followers of Jesus before they were Christians. Christians is kind of the imperialist term that came later, but the early followers of the way, followers of Jesus, that's what they did. But in time, as Christianity became imperialized, missions work was used to basically conquer and expand empire, right? It was used to, that word again, hegemonically, is to dominate, hegemonically empower, like use power over people basically, and say, you know, here, you're wrong, we're going to dominate you with our beliefs and with our systems because you're wrong and we're right. And I mean, obviously maybe not as simple as that, but anyway, you can kind of see what happened. You know, eventually Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. And then you go through history and you've got the Crusades, you've got the Inquisitions, you've got all these different, the doctrine of discovery, all these different things happening in the name of Jesus. Yeah. That don't look anything at all like Jesus.
Yeah, I feel like Jesus is up there going, nah, that wasn't me, bro.
Exactly. And so, but it's interesting. He says, Jennings claimed, this is, I only heard him talk about this in an interview, but he said that it's interesting because the first type of missionary experienced like great persecution. Like they experienced awful persecution, and it was usually at the hands of the other type of missionary, the imperial ones. And so it's just, again, it shows, it demonstrates there's something about the way of Jesus that is anti-imperial in nature, the true authentic way of Jesus that speaks truth to power, that goes against everything the empire stands for. And so the only way you can squash that, you know, is to, well, co-opt the narrative.
Yeah, right? Co-opt the narrative, and literally at every possible juncture work to eradicate the culture that would be too broad and vast for Christianity to overtake. And I think that is, for me, is the real travesty. Like I said before, like there was already fully functioning peoples and cultures and societies with rituals and artistic works and spiritual practices but they didn't look enough like like Christendom. And if you look up into today, right, we have this imperialistic idea of Christianity, and you can see that how that's failed other religious practices. Because I was actually reading an article from the Pluralism Project, which is an offshoot of Harvard, and they're talking about Native American persecution, because a lot of times Native American persecution doesn't fall under other protected religious freedoms because it actually functions outside the binaries that Western spirituality and Christian embodied. So a lot of times, even up into our exact modern day, Native American spirituality and culture is stifled and systematically unprotected by at least our Supreme Court. I mean, our one of our most liberal Supreme Court justices was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and she failed Native American people. And I mean, we have created another empire, is what we've done. And we're doing the same thing to the peoples that were here that the Romans did to the peoples of the land that they conquered, that the Babylonians and the Assyrians did to the people that they conquered. We are just, right now we're bolstering the empire.
Yeah, but what's almost worse is it's almost even worse what we've done, because we, Europeans essentially needed a reason to be exceptional is kind of what it came down to, right?
Yep.
It's like they left their lands and
Yep.
came to somebody else's lands far across the sea, right?
Yep.
Totally different continent.
Yep.
And decided to set up shop and basically create their own empire. And in so doing, decided that they were the new Israel, I guess. Like that's another, like that's a whole other thing, because it's like, not only did they see indigenous peoples as like a threat to them,
Mm-hmm.
but they essentially used propaganda straight from narratives in scripture that demonized them, right? They
Yep.
essentially referred to them as the Canaanites and themselves as the chosen people of God.
Yep.
Right? They set up shop. They named regions of America after the Canaanite conquest. You've got New Jericho and New Jerusalem and all these different places.
Yep.
And they exist to this day. Those cities and those towns and counties and whatever they have there. So it's like they essentially decided that we are God's chosen and God is on our side, and the fact that we are destroying these people just proves that God is on our side, which is not the message of Jesus at all.
Not
it's
at all.
In fact, it's that which steals and kills and destroys. That's the exact opposite of Jesus. It's what I like to call
empirically in line. You know what I mean? Like, it would seem to be that what steals, kills, and destroys is supposed to be anti-Jesus, and what currently and historically what is stolen, killed, and destroyed has been Christianity and American government, and it sounds like to some extent Canadian as well. Yeah, I mean, it's just wild to me. Like.
Yeah, and when you start digging into it, I've been doing some posts on dispensationalism and supersessionism, which is these two beliefs that basically dispensationalism is a literal reading of Revelation, book of Revelation, saying that, there's going to be a literal rapture, and that basically history is divided into 7 dispensations, and we're coming up to, the 7th is the return of Jesus kind of thing. And the book of Revelation is going to happen, and it's this whole belief. Anyway, it arrived in the 1800s, mid 1800s. It's really not that old of a belief, but it became very, very popular very quickly in America, and the entire fundamentalist movement, which then sparked the modern evangelicalism we see today. That whole thing was basically based on dispensationalism and the belief that Jesus is coming soon.
Yep.
But tied to dispensationalism is this belief in supersessionism, which is very much tied to, it basically suggests that once Christ returns, Christians will replace the Jews as God's chosen people. And so the belief goes that for Jesus to return, one of the things that they believe in prophecy is that Israel must become a nation. But when Christ returns, suddenly Israel stops being God's chosen people, and it's the Christians. And so it was this belief that America is actually the new Israel, and that America will become the new chosen people of God. And that's where you get this very deeply nationalistic, evangelical, right-wing kind of whole thing comes from. That's basically where it comes from. And yet, and people that are quote unquote pro-Israel, but baked into it is actually anti-Semitism. It's actually very anti-Semitic at its core.
Yes.
And so that's another thing, right? I mean, it all ties into this exceptionalism of like, America must be exceptional. It has to be. And Canada too. I mean, we're just America North up here, really. It's like, I'm speaking us too. We're not off the hook.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's wild because I used to be such a conspiracy theorist evangelical, right? Like that used to be my vibe, and I've come to such a different place, but like there's conspiracy theories abound here as well, because it's actually founded this idea, right? Like you can trace these things in a lot of the studies that I've been doing within early Christianity, right? And the transition from Judaism to Christianity and how the Bible was canonized and all of that. You see all of that play out up into the modern day. And it is linear. It is scarily linear when you get back to the proof text, when you get off freedomeagle.net, where it says that the vaccine is created by the devil because there was 666 in the barcode. When you get off of that train and you actually really start to look at the development of Christianity, you can see exactly how we got to the place where we were okay with warehousing and murdering children.
Yeah.
You can see it.
It's wild. And it's ironic because most Christians call themselves pro-life, right? Mm-hmm. But baked into it is sadly the opposite, right? It's very harmful, and it's caused tremendous death, widespread death, unfortunately, right? Yep. And it's a deep irony, and we're most people are blind to it. Until only recently, I myself was blind to it.
Same.
And that's probably why I still have a lot of compassion for people who are blind to it, because I know I was one of those people, right?
Absolutely. So I could probably talk to you for like 7 more hours, to be honest, because we're like vibing right now. But I would love to kind of pose a question, not to necessarily wrap us up, but I'd love to turn a corner a little bit in our last couple minutes here. And I'd love to know, kind of from the research that you've done and with the acknowledgement that you are a non-Indigenous person of Christian background who is just trying to do their best, right? We're putting that out there, and knowing that you do not have to speak for all of Christianity because it's far too much to put that on one person's shoulders. But with those acknowledgements, what do you think Christianity as a whole needs to do? And what do you think our nations need to do to decolonize and to honor and not even reconcile, but reconcile with Native populations? Solve this in 5 minutes.
Oh my gosh, in 5 minutes. I think just the first thing immediately that comes to mind is we need to abandon bad theology. Mm-hmm. Just straight up walk away from theologies that harm, theologies that are rooted in fear, theologies that are used to control people. Yep. So I would say, like I've already listed some of them: penal, substitutionary, atonement, dispensationalism, supersessionism. Mm-hmm. I hesitate to even call those theologies. Those are more like conspiracy theories. If anything, that's really what that is. It's not rooted in anything biblical, really, at all. Yep. And so, I think we have to ask ourselves, and I think this is where wisdom comes in. It's, we have to be very careful. I think we just have to use that discernment to know whether or not, something does this theology work for everybody, or does it benefit me? Does it benefit me and my privilege? Does it make me more comfortable? Mm-hmm. Is this actually good news? And I think we need to be asking, is this good news for those who are most marginalized and most oppressed in our midst, right? And I think that needs to be the overarching question we look at with almost everything. If we are seriously wanting to decolonize, not just Christianity, but in every aspect of our lives, is this candidate I'm voting for, is this person helping the person who is a recent immigrant to my country, who just lost their job, or who, are they going to be deported?
This person trying to wall off our borders, maybe, because that's
exactly
what we have here. And we have a whole group of religious zealots that are convinced that this person who is trying to wall off our borders to refugees was somehow the messenger of God. Like, that is, if you hold that up to good theology, that is immediately a heretical and downright what I would say the embodiment of evil. That's what I would say. 100%.
Yeah. And it's interesting because even the word devil, if you look at it in the Greek, it was Richard Rohr who pointed this one out to me, but he essentially alludes to the fact that devil in Greek means many evils. It's systems of evil. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, evil is in the word devil, right?
Yep.
And it's, we have to, I think devil then comes disguised. Sometimes it works really well for a lot of people, especially those at the top, those with privilege. And I think that's where sometimes we as white individuals in the West naturally miss where the devil is actually at work. We mistake the devil for God all the time because of white supremacy, and I'm learning to be more aware of that myself, and I'm still going to get that wrong so many times, just naturally, because I'm a white male. Like I am, and I'm going to, almost all the systems and governance and everything in this country benefits me mostly, right? I benefit the most from these systems the way they are, and so naturally I have to look beyond myself. And I think that's what's so important about decolonizing. I think that's the work of decolonizing, is learning to see beyond ourselves, learning to see from perspectives that are not our own, and learning to understand that what we maybe thought was good news is actually, in fact, bad news.
Yeah. When you hold it up to the light, is it good news for everybody? And I think that that's part of what you said about, like kind of taking off your glasses of colonization is wildly important. You have to know it exists, and you have to be willing to remove those glasses that undoubtedly and explicitly afford you privilege. You have to do it, or you can't do the work of decolonization. And I think I would add to that too, that I think you have to do that by intentionally being intersectional. You cannot change the way you think if you continue to run into the same people and ideas that you've always thought. Your thought is never going to change. You need to find a Native American or you need to find a Native or Indigenous nonprofit where you can volunteer. You need to find a YouTube video that you can watch conversations. You need to find social media accounts that you can follow. You need to actively do the work of decolonizing yourself, because it's not the fault. It's not the responsibility of the person who is marginalized. It's the responsibility of the oppressor to not.
Yes. And I think it's important that we do decolonize. And I think decolonizing involves learning. That's the biggest thing and I mean, this is where I'm challenged too, because I'm a white person running a account that claims decolonizing in the title. And I've wrestled with even changing the name of it in the past, but at the end of the day, it's a journey, right? And I think that's part of the process. But the whole point is to silence our own voices as much as possible and learn from those who are already doing this work of decolonizing. And I think the next step after decolonizing is then dismantling systems of oppression, right? And I think it's part of decolonizing is supporting those people who are doing the work of dismantling oppression, because that work is really only it's done by the people who, the systems around us that built these great empires that we call America and Canada and Australia and wherever else in the West. It's the people that those systems do not work for already and have historically dominated and destroyed their cultures and languages and whatever else. So I think that's kind of the next step, right? It's we learn, we decolonize ourselves, and then we learn and we become allies. It's not even I use that word very hesitantly, ally, because it's not in my own I don't get to determine if I'm an ally. That's not my choice, or that's not my response. I don't get to have that say, right? I don't get to have that. So but I think working alongside the people who are doing the work of dismantling, and then I think helping them dismantle those systems that do oppress and build a better world. I think this whole thing comes back to this idea of, and this is where I still find hope in Christianity, at least in aspects of Christianity, this idea that, and maybe this is Judaism, I don't know, right? But everyone made in the image of the divine, and we have this ability to create alongside the divine. And I think we can create the world that we want to create. And I think our world really desperately needs it. I think our environment needs it. I think this is the path forward. And if we don't do this work, I mean, we could be in some serious trouble moving forward. I don't think humanity can survive another 100 years without this work. So
I agree very much so. There is there is no passive decolonization. There is no passive dismantling. There is no passive interfaith work. There is no passive justice, belief in justice. You either contribute to the system or you contribute to the destruction of unhealthy systems. That's all there is to it, really. So,
Yeah.
well, thank you so much for all of your thoughts. I really can't wait to continue to interact with you, especially through your Instagram, and as we see these other ideas, come up, especially on conversations. But would you do me a favor, and for anyone who is watching who wants to follow your work, we haven't explicitly stated it, so can you just kind of let people know, here's a chance for a commercial for your work, for the idea, any resources they should know, including your own channel?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so you can follow me on Instagram at _decolonized_Christian. I'm also on Twitter. I'm trying to remember my Twitter handle name. I think it's at the Decolonize CHR. It's
Okay.
what it is on Twitter.
All right.
They wouldn't allow me to use the same handle for whatever reason. So I think they have a character limit there. I also have a blog, the decolonizedchristian.com. I haven't updated it lately, but I plan to do so more. I'm very new to the world of blogging, so it's not great. I've only got a few posts, but it's just a few thoughts.
Yeah.
And I hope to improve on that in the future. But and then for any resources and things that I encourage people to check out, I have a highlight on my page called resources, and I definitely recommend people check that out. I'm constantly posting books and other materials that, whether it's podcast episodes or things like that, I find very, very helpful. So yeah, I'm usually just posting the things that I'm learning myself as resources, and I'm just sharing those things. And yeah, if you want to be on this journey with me, I just invite you along. It's just basically, I almost see I kind of alluded to this earlier, but I see my page as like my own personal journal almost of, this is how I'm learning and this is how I'm moving forward. And it's fun looking back and seeing that, hey, I'm not even the same person I was a year ago as I started this journey. And I think that's important because we're always people in transition. We're always people moving forward on a journey, and we've never made it. I think that's the key, especially for those of us who are white. The key is that we've never arrived. And I think we need to learn to be okay with that reality of, like, I think we just get to enjoy as much as we can, enjoy the process, trust the process, and find life in that work, and so it's tough at times. It's tough. It's uncomfortable. These are uncomfortable conversations, but I think it's so rewarding and it's so worth it. And we get to be part together of creating a better world. So.
Absolutely. That co-creative, that idea of being co-creative with divinity is one of the things that like really that sticks for me when the pressure hose of like bad theology comes out and we start to see what falls away. That co-creative nature comes out. And I think it's important to realize we have agency in dismantling the systems, especially if we are people with certain privileges. We have even more agency, and privilege is not necessarily problematic until you hoard it and you don't use it. So I think we have to be conscious of that. I really appreciate your page and the way you've set it up. For those who are watching, definitely check out the Decolonized Christian, because the highlights up there have so many good resources, more than I could ever even list in this show notes. So I would encourage you folks to check it out. Also, like I mentioned before, we do have some really dope conversations coming up. So you can find me here every Wednesday night, either on my personal page or on the conversations page. I'm just trying to mess with the algorithm to see what works better, but you can find me here every week for more spiritually minded conversations about life, belief, and the intersection of the two. The main tenet and the thing that I want everyone to know is that everybody's voice is welcome at the conversation. If you're interested in finding out more about conversations, you can check out the Conversations official Facebook page, the Conversations official Facebook group, the Conversations official Instagram, or you can follow me on TikTok at spirituallynb leowt for some sort of short form sassy versions of what we talk talk about on Conversations. And if you're watching and you are able to, it would be fantastic if you'd be able to help this work of Conversations grow by contributing to Conversations via the Conversations official Patreon. What that does is establishes a monthly contribution, especially if you're, kind of using this in place of like, your spiritual conversation for the week or your community gathering. It would be awesome if you could help us further Conversations by making us more accessible with subtitles and transcripts for people who are not able to listen. It would be great if you could help us become more accessible in that way. Please visit the Conversations official page to find the link to the Patreon, and I'll post it in the show notes as well. Thank you so much for coming on this conversation, friend, and thank you everybody for watching. We will see you next week at the conversation. Bye.
This has been the Conversations Podcast. Thank you so much for joining. If you have any questions or comments, or just want to get involved, feel free to join the conversation on social media. You can find us at Conversations Official on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And please don't forget to rate, follow, and share this podcast. We're available on Anchor, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for joining the conversation.